The letter crackled in Darren's weathered hands like kindling waiting for a match. Clara Belle Whitmore stood frozen near the pickle barrel, 26 years old, and wishing she could fold herself small enough to vanish between the floorboards. The trading post smelled like tobacco, kerosene, and the particular sourness of men who bathed once a month whether they needed it or not. "Dear Mr. Whitmore," Darren read, his voice dripping with theatrical pleasure. "Thank you for your letter regarding your sister Clara as a potential wife." Someone snickered near the gun cabinet. Clara's face burned. "I appreciate that times are difficult and that families must make practical arrangements." Darren paused, milking the moment. His audience leaned forward. Mrs. Hutchins clutched her shopping basket tighter. Even old Pete Morrison stopped counting his change. Clara's brother continued. "However, after careful consideration and consultation with my ranch hands, I must respectfully decline." The first real laugh came from Tommy Baker, that rat-faced boy who worked at the stable. Others joined in, tentative at first, then bolder. A woman of Clara's substantial size would require considerable resources to feed properly. Darren's voice rose above the growing noise. "Furthermore, I need a wife capable of the physical demands of ranch life. I fear your sister, however kind she may be, appears too soft for the rigors of frontier survival. My men suggested she might slow down operations rather than contribute to them. I wish her well in finding a more suitable situation. Regards, Edmund Halstead." The explosion of laughter that followed felt like a physical blow. Clara's vision blurred. The room spun sideways. She heard boots stomping, hands slapping against thighs, high-pitched cackling from Martha Collins, who'd never worked a hard day in her miserable life. "Too large to feed," someone shouted. "Too soft to survive," another voice echoed. "Maybe she should try being a cushion instead of a wife." The cruelty multiplied, each comment building on the last like a snowball rolling downhill, gathering mass and momentum. Clara's breath came in short, painful gasps. Her hands gripped the edge of the pickle barrel so hard her knuckles went white. Darren folded the letter with exaggerated care, tucking it back into his coat. He wasn't smiling anymore. That would have been too human. Instead, his face held that familiar expression of cold satisfaction, the look he wore whenever he'd successfully punished Clara for the crime of existing. "Well, sis," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks like you'll be staying home after all. Lucky me." More laughter. Clara finally forced her legs to move. She stumbled toward the door, her vision still swimming, her chest so tight she couldn't draw a full breath. Behind her the noise continued. Jokes, speculation about what man would ever be desperate enough to take her. Suggestions that maybe she should try the hog farmers instead of respectable ranchers. She burst through the door into the October afternoon. The sun sat fat and orange above the mountains, indifferent to her humiliation. Black Hollow Ridge stretched before her in all its dying glory, a collection of weathered buildings clinging to existence in a valley that should have been abandoned years ago. Clara walked fast, her boots kicking up dust from the unpaved street. She didn't head home, couldn't bear the thought of those four walls closing in around her yet. Instead, she turned toward the creek bed on the eastern edge of town, where scrub grass grew thick enough to hide her from the road. She made it exactly 50 yards before the tears came. They weren't delicate tears. Nothing about Clara was delicate. These were ugly, choking sobs that bent her double, that made her gasp and heave like she was dying. Maybe she was. Maybe you could die from shame. Maybe enough humiliation could stop your heart just as surely as a bullet. She collapsed beside a struggling cottonwood tree, her skirts pooling around her in the dirt. The sobs tore through her chest in waves. Each breath hurt. Each memory of those laughing faces felt like a fresh wound. Too large to feed, too soft to survive. She might slow down operations rather than contribute to them. The words played on repeat in her skull, a vicious echo chamber of rejection. Clara pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to physically stop the tears. It didn't work. Nothing worked. The dam had broken, and years of swallowed pain came flooding out all at once. She tried so hard. Every single day, she tried. She worked herself to exhaustion, helping Darren maintain their failing homestead. She sewed clothes for other families to earn extra pennies. She hauled water, chopped wood, tended their pathetic vegetable garden, cooked, cleaned, and never complained. And for what? To be the town joke. To have her own brother use her as entertainment. To discover that even desperate ranchers found her repulsive. The sun slid lower. Shadows stretched long across the valley. Clara's tears eventually ran dry. Not because the pain stopped, but because her body simply ran out of moisture. She sat there in the dirt, empty and hollow, while the first evening chill crept down from the mountains. A jackrabbit bounded past, startling her. She watched it disappear into the sagebrush, envying its freedom. Animals didn't have to worry about marriage prospects or body size or whether they contributed enough to justify their existence. There you are. Claire's head snapped up. Darren stood 10 feet away, backlit by the dying sun. He'd found her. Of course he'd found her. She could never hide from him for long. Enjoying your pity party? He walked closer, his boots crunching on dry grass. Because while you're out here crying about your hurt feelings, there's work waiting at home. Or did you forget that we've got 3 overdue payments to the land office? Clara stared at him. Her brother. The only family she had left since their parents died in the cholera outbreak 6 years back. The man who was supposed to protect her. Why did you do that? Her voice came out raw, scraped clean. Why did you read that letter in front of everyone? Darren snorted. Maybe you needed to hear the truth. Maybe it's time you understood that no man wants you, Clara. Not Edmund Halstead. Not anyone. You're 26 years old, fat as a Christmas goose, and about as useful as a 3-legged mule. Each word landed like a fist. I've tried everything, Darren continued, his voice rising. I've written to every bachelor within 200 miles. I've talked to widowers, to older men, to anyone who might take you off my hands. And you know what? They all say the same thing. Too big, too quiet, too much work, and not enough value. I work hard, Clara whispered. You know I do. You eat more than you're worth, Darren shot back. Every meal is less money in my pocket. Every day you're still here is another day I can't afford a wife of my own because I'm stuck feeding you. The cruelty was nothing new, but tonight it felt sharper. Maybe because she'd already been flayed raw in front of the whole town. Maybe because she finally understood that her brother genuinely hated her. I've got debts, Clara, serious debts. The land office wants their money by end of month or they're taking the homestead, and I've got nothing left to sell except... He trailed off, his eyes calculating something. Clara's stomach dropped. Except what? Darren's mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile on a kinder man. There's a rancher up past Frostbite Canyon, Silas Granger. You heard of him? Everyone had heard of Silas Granger. The stories circulated through Black Hollow Ridge like warnings. A mountain cattleman who'd lost his wife and young son when they fell through the ice on their property 7 years back. The grief had turned him into something barely human, violent, isolated, dangerous. He'd supposedly beaten one of his ranch hands so badly the man couldn't work for 6 months. Another story claimed he'd shot a wolf with his bare hands after it killed one of his steers. What about him? Clara asked, though she already knew. Her blood turned to ice water. He needs someone to work his ranch. Cook, clean, maintain the property. He don't care what they look like or how soft they are. He just needs help. You want to send me to work for a madman? I want to solve my problem, Darren corrected. Granger's paying $200 up front for a woman willing to work his ranch through winter. That money clears my debts and gets you out of my house. Everybody wins. Except me, Clara said quietly. You got better options? Darren's eyebrows rose in mock curiosity. You planning to marry one of your imaginary suitors? Or maybe you'll just keep living off my charity while I starve trying to keep us both fed. Clara looked away. The mountains loomed purple-black against the darkening sky. Frostbite Canyon lay somewhere beyond them, a jagged scar cutting through the northern wilderness. Silas Granger's ranch existed at the very edge of civilization, where the law barely reached and men made their own rules. I won't do it, she said, trying to sound firm. You can't make me. Darren's expression went flat. Can I? You live in my house. You eat my food. Far as frontier law cares, you're my responsibility until some man claims you, and if I say you're going to Granger's ranch, then that's where you're going. Please. The word escaped before Clara could stop it. She hated herself for begging. Please don't do this. He's coming to collect you tomorrow morning. I already sent word. Darren turned to leave, then paused. Pack light. Granger don't tolerate laziness or complaining. You do your work, keep your head down, and maybe you'll survive until spring. Maybe. He walked away, leaving Clara alone in the gathering darkness. She sat there until the stars came out, thousands of them scattered across the black sky like salt spilled on velvet. The temperature dropped fast. Her breath formed small clouds in front of her face. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped and was answered by another. Clara thought about running. Just walking into those mountains and never coming back. Let the cold or the animals or simple starvation take her. It would be easier than facing tomorrow. But even as she thought it, she knew she wouldn't do it. Survival was coded too deep in her bones. Even now, after everything, some stubborn part of her refused to quit. So she eventually stood up, brushed the dirt from her skirts, and walked back to the small dark house she shared with her brother. Neither of them spoke that night. Darren ate his dinner in silence while Clara packed her few belongings into a canvas bag: 2 spare dresses, some undergarments, a hairbrush with half its bristles missing, and the small wooden horse her father had carved for her 15th birthday. She barely slept. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the laughing faces from the trading post, heard Edmund Halstead's letter being read aloud, felt the weight of her brother's hatred pressing down on her chest like a stone. Morning came too fast. Clara was washing her face in the basin when she heard the horses outside. Her hands froze. Through the streaked window, she could see a wagon pulling up, solid and well-maintained, pulled by 2 sturdy draft horses that looked better fed than most people in Black Hollow Ridge. "He's here!" Darren called from the front room. There might have been relief in his voice. "Get your things." Clara dried her face with shaking hands. She picked up her bag, walked through the small house one last time, memorizing details she'd never see again. The crooked nail where her mother's shawl used to hang, the scorch mark on the kitchen table from when she dropped a hot pan at age 12, the window with the crack shaped like a lightning bolt. She stepped outside. The man sitting on the wagon didn't look like a monster. That was the first surprising thing. Silas Granger was maybe 40, tall and lean, with dark hair going gray at the temples, and a face that looked like it had been carved from the same granite as the mountains behind him. He wore working clothes, canvas pants, a heavy coat, scarred boots. His hands on the reins were calloused and strong, but it was his eyes that made Clara's breath catch. They were gray-blue, the color of ice over deep water. And when they looked at her, they didn't show disgust or amusement or the cruel satisfaction that usually met her appearance. They showed nothing at all. Complete, absolute nothing. "This her?" Granger's voice was rough from disuse, like he didn't speak often. "That's Clara," Darren confirmed. He practically shoved her forward. "She's a hard worker when she ain't feeling sorry for herself. Knows how to cook, clean, sew. She'll do what you tell her." Granger's gaze moved over Clara with clinical detachment, assessing, measuring, but not judging. At least not in any way she could read. "She understand the terms?" he asked Darren. "She understands." "I need to hear it from her." Those cold eyes fixed on Clara's face. "You understand you're coming to work on my ranch? That it's hard labor from sunup to past sundown? That you'll do what I say, when I say it, without complaint?" Clara's mouth was dry as old leather. "Yes." "You understand there ain't no town nearby? No neighbors? No help if things go wrong?" "Yes." "And you understand that if you can't handle the work, if you cause problems, I'll send you back and your brother don't get his money back?" That last part made Darren stiffen, but he didn't interrupt. "I understand," Clara said quietly. Granger studied her a moment longer, then nodded once. "Get in the wagon." Clara looked back at the house, at her brother. Some tiny, pathetic part of her hoped he might show a shred of regret. A moment of hesitation. Anything to suggest he cared at all about what happened to her. Darren's face remained impassive. "Go on, then." Clara climbed into the wagon bed, her bag clutched against her chest. Granger made a clicking sound, and the horses started forward. The wagon lurched into motion. Black Hollow Ridge fell away behind them. The trading post where she'd been humiliated. The small house where she'd spent 6 miserable years. The whole dying town that had never wanted her. Clara watched it shrink into the distance and felt nothing. Not sadness, not relief, just a vast, echoing emptiness. They traveled north into country that grew wilder with each passing mile. The road, barely more than wagon ruts through scrub grass, climbed steadily into the foothills. Pine forest closed in on both sides, dark and dense. The air thinned and sharpened with altitude. Granger didn't speak, didn't look back at her. Just drove the wagon with steady competence, his shoulders set against the wind that picked up as they climbed higher. Clara pulled her shawl tighter. The temperature was dropping fast. October in the mountains meant winter was coming. Real winter, the kind that killed people who weren't prepared. They passed through a narrow gap between 2 towering rock faces. Frostbite Canyon. Clara had heard stories about this place, how it stayed frozen even in summer, how the wind screamed through it like the voices of the dead. The stories weren't entirely wrong. Ice clung to the shadowed north faces of the rocks. The wind did howl, making an eerie sound that raised the hair on Clara's neck. And then they were through, emerging onto a high plateau ringed by mountains. The land here was different, rougher, more raw. This was where civilization ended and the true wilderness began. "Another hour," Granger said suddenly, startling Clara. It was the first time he'd spoken since they left Black Hollow Ridge. "Yes, sir," Clara said, because she didn't know what else to say. The wagon rolled on. The sun climbed higher but gave little warmth. Clara's fingers went numb inside her thin gloves. She wondered if she'd been a fool not to run when she had the chance. Wondered if this was how people felt before they died. This strange combination of fear and resignation. Finally, the ranch appeared in the distance. It sat in a shallow valley, protected on 3 sides by pine forest, and on the 4th by a steep ridge. The main house was built from logs, solid and square, with a stone chimney rising from one end. There was a barn, several outbuildings, corrals for livestock. Everything looked neglected. Not falling apart, but worn, tired, like a place that had stopped caring whether it survived. Granger pulled the wagon up in front of the main house and set the brake. He climbed down without offering to help Clara, which was fine. She managed on her own, her legs stiff from the long ride. "Barn first," Granger said. He unhitched the horses with practiced efficiency and led them inside. Clara followed, unsure whether she should help or stay out of the way. The barn was dim and cool, smelling of hay and horses and old wood. Granger settled the draft horses in their stalls, gave them grain and water. His movements were economical, precise, no wasted motion. When he finished, he turned to face Clara directly for the first time. Up close, she could see the lines etched deep around his eyes and mouth, lines from pain, not laughter. This was a man who'd stopped finding joy in anything a long time ago. "Rules," he said. "You work 6 days. Sunday you rest. You cook 3 meals a day for both of us. You clean the house. You help with whatever livestock work I need done. You repair clothes, mend fences, haul water, chop kindling. Basically, if something needs doing, you do it." Clara nodded. "You get your own cabin." He gestured vaguely toward one of the outbuildings. "It's small, but it's dry. There's a stove. I'll bring you firewood. You're responsible for keeping your own space clean." "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir. Name's Silas. You call me that, or you don't call me nothing." "Yes, Silas." His jaw tightened slightly, like hearing his name spoken caused him physical discomfort. "One more thing. The room at the end of the hallway in the main house. It stays locked. You don't go in there. You don't ask about it. You don't even look at it too hard. Understand?" Something in his voice made Clara's skin prickle. "I understand." "Good." He walked past her, heading toward the house. "Come on, I'll show you the kitchen." The next few hours passed in a blur of information. Silas showed her where everything was kept, the food stores, the cooking equipment, the cleaning supplies. He explained his schedule, his preferences for meals, the quirks of the wood stove. He spoke in short, clipped sentences, like every word cost him something. The locked room sat at the end of a short hallway on the upper floor. Its door was heavy oak, darker than the others. Clara caught herself staring at it once and forced her eyes away. Whatever secrets it held, they weren't hers to know. By late afternoon, Silas led her to the small cabin that would be hers. It was maybe 12 feet square, with a narrow bed, a potbelly stove, a single chair, and a small table. One window looked out toward the mountains. The roof leaked in one corner. She could see water stains on the floor. "I'll bring your firewood before dark," Silas said from the doorway. "Breakfast is at dawn. Don't be late." Then he was gone, leaving Clara alone in her new prison. She sat on the bed. The mattress was thin but clean. Through the window, she could see the sun starting its descent toward the western peaks. The light turned everything gold and amber, the pine trees, the mountains, the weathered wood of the outbuildings. It was beautiful in a harsh, unforgiving way. Like everything else out here, Clara lay back on the bed and stared at the ceiling. She thought about the trading post, about Edmund Halstead's letter, about her brother's face when he told her no one would ever want her, and she thought about Silas Granger's eyes, cold, empty, carefully guarded. A man who looked at her without disgust, yes, but also without hope, without anything at all. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves. Clara pulled the thin blanket over herself and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. Tonight, she just needed to survive the silence. Dawn came cold and gray, seeping through the cabin window like dirty water. Clara woke to the sound of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Her body ached from the thin mattress, and her breath formed small clouds in the frigid air. The fire in the potbelly stove had died hours ago. She dressed quickly, layering everything she owned against the cold. Her fingers fumbled with buttons that didn't want to cooperate. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from the main house chimney. Silas was already awake. The walk from her cabin to the main house felt longer than it should have. Frost crunched under her boots. The sky was that peculiar pre-dawn color, not quite black, not quite blue. Stars still clung to the western horizon like they didn't want to leave. Clara pushed open the kitchen door. Heat hit her face immediately, blessed and welcome. Silas stood at the stove, poking at the fire with an iron rod. He didn't turn around. "Coffee's on the counter," he said. "Cups in the cabinet above." Clara poured herself a cup with shaking hands. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, bitter and scalding. It tasted like heaven. "Chickens need feeding," Silas continued, still not looking at her. "Coops behind the barn, grains in the storage shed, the one with the red door. Collect the eggs while you're there. Then come back and start breakfast. I want bacon, eggs, biscuits. There's salt pork in the cold cellar and flour in the pantry." "Yes, yes," Clara caught herself. "What time do you want breakfast ready?" "Hour from now." He finally turned, his gray eyes flat in the dim light. "That a problem?" "No." "Good." He walked past her and out the door, letting in a blast of cold air that made the stove flames flicker. Clara stood there for a moment, clutching her coffee cup, trying to organize the rush of instructions in her head. Then she set down the cup and got to work. The chicken coop was farther than she expected, tucked behind the barn in a small clearing. The birds clucked and fussed when she entered, their feathers puffed against the cold. Clara found the grain bucket and scattered feed while they swarmed around her feet. The eggs sat in nests lined with straw, 18 of them, still warm. She gathered them carefully in her apron, cradling them like precious things. Back in the kitchen, she moved through the unfamiliar space with growing confidence. The stove was temperamental, requiring constant adjustment to maintain the right temperature. The salt pork needed soaking to remove some of the salt. The biscuit dough fought her at first. Too dry, then too wet, before finally coming together into something workable. Silas returned exactly an hour later. He washed his hands at the basin without speaking, then sat at the rough-hewn table. Clara placed the food in front of him: crispy bacon, scrambled eggs, biscuits that were only slightly lopsided. He ate without comment. No, thank you. No criticism. Just mechanical consumption of fuel. Like the food was no different from the wood he fed to the stove. Clara fixed her own plate and sat across from him, suddenly aware of how loud her chewing sounded in the silence. She tried to eat quietly, to make herself small and unobtrusive. "You don't gotta whisper eat," Silas said suddenly, startling her. "I ain't gonna bite you for making noise. Sorry, And stop apologizing." He sopped up egg yolk with a biscuit. "You're here to work, not to grovel." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. They finished the meal in heavy silence. When Silas stood, he stacked his dishes in the wash basin and turned to her. "After you clean up, there's mending in the basket by the fireplace. Shirts, pants, some torn blankets. You know how to sew?" "Yes." "Then get it done. When you finish that, come find me in the barn. We got fence repairs to handle before the weather turns." He left again. Clara washed the dishes, her hands turning red in the cold water. Then she found the mending basket, overflowing with clothes that should have been repaired months ago. Some of the tears were so bad she'd have to patch, rather than simply sew. The blankets had holes the size of her fist. She worked through the morning, her fingers growing sore from pushing the needle through thick fabric. The house was eerily quiet except for the occasional pop from the fireplace and the wind rattling the windows. Clara found herself glancing at the stairs that led to the upper floor, to the locked room at the end of the hall. What was in there? Why did Silas guard it so fiercely? She forced her attention back to the mending. Not her business. Not her place to wonder. By noon, she'd finished half the basket. Her neck ached from hunching over the work. She stood, stretched, and headed to the barn to find Silas. He was in the far corral with a bay gelding that looked mean. The horse stamped and tossed its head while Silas worked patiently with a halter, his voice low and steady. Clara approached slowly, not wanting to spook the animal. "This one's got a nasty streak," Silas said without looking at her. "Previous owner beat him. Now he don't trust nobody." "Will he settle?" "Maybe. Maybe not. Some things stay broken." He finally got the halter on and tied the horse to the fence post. "You done with the mending?" "Half of it. Finish the rest tomorrow. Right now, I need help with the north fence. Grab those gloves from the hook and follow me." They walked through the pine forest to where the fence line ran. Several posts had rotted through and the wire sagged badly. Silas handed Clara a post hole digger that weighed nearly as much as she did. "You ever dig post holes?" he asked. "No." "Then watch." He demonstrated, driving the digger into the hard ground, twisting, pulling up dirt and rocks. "Your turn." Clara took the digger. The first attempt barely scratched the surface. The second wasn't much better. By the third, she was breathing hard and her shoulders burned. "Harder," Silas said. "The ground don't care if you're tired." She gritted her teeth and drove the digger down with everything she had. It bit deeper this time. She twisted, pulled, deposited the dirt, again, and again, and again. Sweat ran down her back despite the cold. Her hands blistered inside the gloves. Her arms shook with fatigue, but slowly, impossibly, the hole deepened. "That'll do," Silas said finally. He set a new post in place while Clara held it steady, then packed dirt around the base. They moved to the next damaged section and started over. They worked until the light began to fail. Clara's entire body screamed with exhaustion. Her hands were raw even through the gloves. Her back felt like someone had beaten it with a board. "We'll finish tomorrow," Silas said, gathering the tools. "Go start supper. I want stew. There's venison in the cold cellar, and make enough for leftovers." Clara trudged back to the house, barely able to lift her feet. In the kitchen, she found the venison and began the slow process of preparing stew. Her hands shook as she chopped vegetables. Twice she nearly cut herself with the knife. The stew simmered while she set the table. Silas came in smelling like pine sap and horse. He washed up and sat down without a word. The stew was decent. Not great, but edible. Silas ate 2 bowls, then pushed back from the table. "You did all right today," he said. It might have been a compliment, hard to tell from his tone. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we finish the fence, then start on the barn roof before snow hits." Clara cleaned up, banking the stove fire for morning. Then she walked back to her cabin through darkness so complete she could barely see her own hands. Inside, she managed to get a fire going in the potbelly stove before collapsing on the bed fully clothed. Sleep took her immediately, deep and dreamless. The pattern repeated itself day after day. Wake before dawn, feed the chickens, cook breakfast, clean, mend, haul water, chop kindling, help Silas with whatever brutal task needed doing, cook supper, collapse. Clara's body slowly adapted. The blisters hardened into calluses. Her muscles stopped screaming and started merely complaining. She learned the rhythms of the ranch, which animals needed what, when to add wood to which stove, how to read the weather in the morning sky. Silas remained a cipher. He spoke only when necessary, usually to give instructions or point out mistakes. He never praised her work directly, but she noticed small things. When she figured out how to adjust the stove damper to maintain steady heat, he stopped checking behind her. When she repaired a broken harness using a technique her father had taught her years ago, he examined it closely and then used it without comment. Approval through absence of criticism. That was as close to kindness as he seemed capable of. But there were other things too. Strange, contradictory things. One morning, Clara woke to find her cabin roof had been repaired. The leak that had been dripping into the bucket by her bed was gone. Fresh tar sealed the shingles. She asked Silas about it later. "Needed doing," was all he said. Another time, she came back from collecting eggs to find a stack of firewood outside her cabin door, enough to last a week. She hadn't asked for it, hadn't mentioned running low. It was just there. Then there was the matter of the blankets. Clara's single thin blanket was barely enough against the deepening cold. She'd taken to sleeping in every piece of clothing she owned. One evening, she returned to her cabin to find 2 heavy wool blankets folded on her bed. They were old but clean, and warm enough to make her eyes sting with unexpected emotion. Silas never acknowledged these things. If Clara tried to thank him, he'd change the subject or simply walk away. It was like he was allergic to gratitude. The first snow came in mid-November. Clara woke to find the world transformed, white and silent and impossibly beautiful. She stood at her cabin window, mesmerized by the way the morning light turned the snow pink and gold. But beauty didn't stop the work. If anything, winter made everything harder. Water froze in the buckets overnight. The chickens huddled together for warmth and laid fewer eggs. The cattle needed extra hay. Everything took twice as long when you had to break ice and fight through snowdrifts. Clara learned to wrap rags around her boots for better traction. She learned which paths drifted shut and which stayed relatively clear. She learned to read Silas's increasingly rare words and even rarer expressions, to anticipate what he'd need before he asked. They developed an unspoken language, a tilt of the head meaning bring the hammer, a grunt that meant good enough, a certain set to his shoulders that warned her to stay out of his way because something was wrong. And things went wrong with increasing frequency as winter tightened its grip. A sick cow, a broken wagon wheel, a stretch of fence knocked down by a fallen tree. The well pump froze and had to be thawed with boiling water carried in buckets. The barn door warped in the cold and wouldn't close properly until Silas spent half a day planing the edges. Through it all, Silas grew quieter, darker, like the shortening days were pulling him down into some internal winter of his own. Clara first noticed it in his eyes. That flat, empty look started to develop edges, sharp ones. He snapped at the horses for no reason, threw tools when they didn't cooperate, worked himself past exhaustion and then kept going anyway, like he was trying to outrun something. One night in early December, Clara was washing dishes when she heard the crash. It came from upstairs. Her hands froze in the soapy water. Another crash. Then the sound of something breaking. She dried her hands and climbed the stairs quietly. The noise was coming from the locked room. Through the heavy door, she could hear Silas's voice, low, ragged, talking to someone who wasn't there. "I tried," he was saying. "I swear I tried. But the ice, there wasn't time." Claire's hand rose toward the doorknob, then stopped. She remembered the rule. The one absolute rule. She backed away slowly, descended the stairs, finished the dishes with trembling hands. The next morning, Silas looked like he hadn't slept. Dark circles ringed his eyes. His hands shook slightly when he picked up his coffee cup. "You all right?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. His head snapped up. "I'm fine." "You don't look—" "I said I'm fine." His voice was sharp enough to cut. "Worry about your own business." They didn't speak again all day. Silas worked like a man possessed, repairing equipment that didn't need repairing, moving hay bales from one end of the barn to the other, and then moving them back, burning off whatever was eating him from the inside. Clara gave him space. But that night, she left a plate of food outside the main house with a jar of the willow bark tea her mother used to make for headaches. In the morning, both were gone. The darkness in Silas got worse as they approached the winter solstice, the longest, darkest night of the year. He stopped eating properly, stopped sleeping, as far as Clara could tell. His temper grew hair-trigger volatile. Clara was in the barn one afternoon, mucking out stalls, when Silas exploded at the mean bay gelding. The horse had bitten him, not hard, just a nip, but Silas reacted like he'd been shot. He grabbed a riding crop and raised it high. "No!" Clara dropped her pitchfork and ran forward. "Don't!" Silas froze, the crop suspended in midair. He looked at it like he didn't recognize what he was holding. Then at Clara. Then back at the horse. The crop fell from his hand. He turned and walked out of the barn without a word. Clara found him an hour later sitting on a stump behind the woodshed. His head was in his hands. He didn't look up when she approached. "I almost did it," he said quietly. "I almost became the thing I hate." Clara didn't know what to say. She stood there in the snow, her breath steaming in the cold air. "My pa used to beat the horses," Silas continued. His voice was flat, dead. "Beat them, beat my ma, beat me when I got old enough to get in the way. I swore I'd never be like him, and just now I almost—" He looked up at her then, and for the first time Clara saw past the walls he'd built, saw the pain beneath, the guilt, the grief so massive it had no bottom. "What happened to your family?" she asked gently. Silas's jaw tightened. For a moment she thought he'd shut down completely. But then, slowly, words started coming. Halting at first, then faster, like a dam breaking. "Had a wife, Catherine, and a boy, James. He was 7. Silas's voice roughened. "We lived up here year-round back then. Catherine wanted to go into town for Christmas, see her sister. I said no. Said the weather was turning and we should wait." He stopped, started again. "She took James anyway, borrowed my horse, figured she'd be back before dark. But the temperature dropped fast. River that's usually safe to cross. The ice wasn't thick enough yet." His hands clenched into fists. "I found them the next morning. Catherine had tried to save him. Both of them went through. Both of them drowned in water so cold it would have stopped your heart in seconds." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "I pulled them out," Silas continued. "Tried everything I knew to bring them back. But they were already gone. Had been for hours." He looked at Clara with eyes that held nothing but emptiness. And you know what the worst part was? If I'd just said yes. If I'd gone with them or let them go the day before when the weather was clear, they'd still be alive. It was my fault. My stubbornness killed them. That's not, Clara started. It is. His voice was iron. I know what I am. I'm the man who let his family die because he was too proud to listen. And every day since I've been trying to, I don't know, punish myself, work hard enough that I'm too tired to remember, but it don't work. Nothing works. Silence settled between them. A crow called from somewhere in the pines. The wind picked up, scattering snow crystals that caught the weak winter light. You can't carry that forever, Clara said finally. It'll kill you. Good, Silas said simply. No. Clara surprised herself with the firmness in her voice. Not good. You think dying makes it right? You think Catherine would want that? Your son? Silas flinched like she'd struck him. You want to honor them, Clara pressed on. Then live. Actually live. Not this half-dead existence where you work yourself to exhaustion and push everyone away. That's not honor. That's just slow suicide. What do you know about it? Silas stood abruptly. You're just some girl your own brother sold off because nobody wanted you. Don't pretend you understand. You're right, Clara cut him off. I don't understand losing a family like that, but I do understand being so ashamed of yourself that you can't see straight. I understand hating who you are, and I understand that drowning in it doesn't help anything. Silas stared at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not softness exactly, but a crack in the armor. How do you do it? He asked quietly. Walk around like you're not dying inside. I don't, Clara admitted. Most days I want to crawl in a hole and disappear, but I figure, I don't know, maybe surviving is enough. Maybe just making it to tomorrow is all we can do sometimes. Silas nodded slowly. He looked exhausted, like the conversation had drained whatever reserves he'd been running on. I should get back to work, he said. Or you could eat something, Clara suggested. And maybe sleep. When's the last time you actually slept? Don't remember. Come on. She started walking toward the house. I'll make you something, and you're going to eat it, and then you're going to rest, even if I have to knock you out with a frying pan. That got the barest hint of a smile. You threatening me? Promising. They walked back to the house together. Clara made eggs and toast while Silas sat at the table, looking like a man who'd just fought a war. He ate slowly, mechanically. When he finished, he stood like his bones hurt. Thank you, he said. 2 words that sounded rusty from disuse. You're welcome. He climbed the stairs to his room, the one at the opposite end of the hall from the locked door. Clara heard the bed creak as he lay down, then silence. She finished cleaning up, then returned to her cabin. But she couldn't settle. Something had shifted between them today. Some invisible line had been crossed. Silas had let her see him. Actually see him. Not the hard, cold rancher who barked orders and expected obedience, but the broken man underneath, still bleeding from wounds 7 years old. And Clara had told him the truth, that she understood brokenness, that she carried her own weight of shame and self-hatred. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Clara didn't feel quite so alone. The days that followed were different. Silas didn't suddenly become warm or talkative. That wasn't in his nature. But the sharp edges dulled slightly. He still gave orders, but he also started asking her opinion on small things. Which steered a butcher? Whether to repair the chicken coop or build a new one. Whether the bread needed more salt. Clara realized he was trying, in his awkward way, to acknowledge her as a person rather than just a worker. And she found herself responding, not with the fearful deference she'd shown at first, but with genuine thoughts. She disagreed with him sometimes, suggested different approaches, even joked occasionally, though her sense of humor was rusty from disuse. One evening, they were eating supper when Silas said, You never told me why your brother really sent you here. Clara's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. You know why. He needed money. That's the excuse. What's the reason? She set down her fork. He hates me. Why? Because I'm alive and our parents aren't. Because I'm fat and unmarriageable and a drain on his resources. Because I'm a reminder of everything that went wrong in his life. The words came out bitter. Take your pick. Silas was quiet for a moment. He's a fool. What? Your brother. He's a fool. Silas met her eyes directly. You work harder than most men I've hired. You don't complain. You figure things out. He paused, seeming to wrestle with words. You made this place livable again. Before you came, I was just existing, barely. Now there's food that tastes like food. The house is clean. Things work properly. You did that. Clara felt her throat tighten. You're just saying that. I don't just say things. His voice was gruff. I mean it. Whatever your brother thinks you're worth, he's wrong. Dead wrong. It was maybe the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. Clara had to look away before the tears building behind her eyes spilled over. They finished the meal in comfortable silence. And that night, when Clara walked back to her cabin, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Worth. Not much. Just a flicker. But it was there. Christmas came and went without ceremony. Neither of them mentioned it. But Clara woke Christmas morning to find a pair of heavy leather work gloves outside her door, new ones, properly fitted, lined with fleece. Inside the right glove was a small wooden carving of a bird. She held it carefully, studying the details. Someone had spent hours on this, shaping each feather with patient precision. She walked to the main house. Silas was at the stove making coffee. Thank you, Clara said, holding up the gloves and the bird. He glanced over, then back at the coffee. Gloves were practical. Your old ones were falling apart. And the bird? His shoulders tensed. Had some time. Needed something to do with my hands. Clara set the bird carefully on the kitchen shelf. It's beautiful. Silas didn't respond, but the tips of his ears went slightly red. Clara had made him a new coat from fabric she'd bartered for with eggs in the last supply run to town. It wasn't fancy, but it was warmer than his current one and didn't have holes in the elbows. She'd worked on it late at night in her cabin, her fingers cramping in the cold. This is for you, she said, handing it over. Silas took it, examining the stitching with the same careful attention he gave everything. This is good work. Try it on. He shrugged into it. The fit was nearly perfect. She'd guessed his measurements from mending his other clothes. He moved his arms, testing the range of motion. Fits right, he said. Then, after a pause, thank you. They had a better Christmas dinner than Clara had expected. Roast chicken, mashed potatoes, carrots glazed with honey she'd found in the pantry. They even had pie, made from preserved apples. Afterwards, they sat by the fire. Silas had brought out a bottle of whiskey that had been gathering dust somewhere. He poured them each a small glass. To surviving, he said, raising his glass. To surviving, Clara echoed. The whiskey burned going down, but it warmed her from the inside out. They sat in silence, watching the flames dance. Outside, fresh snow was falling, muffling the world in white quiet. You know what's strange? Clara said after a while. The whiskey had loosened her tongue. This is the best Christmas I've had in years. Silas looked at her. That's a low bar. She laughed, actually laughed. Fair point. But yeah, he said quietly. Me too. They didn't say anything else, didn't need to. The fire crackled, the snow fell. And for one night, two broken people sat together in the warmth and didn't feel quite so broken anymore. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. The trouble started 3 days after Christmas, when Clara went to town for supplies. Silas had offered to go instead, but Clara insisted. She needed to prove to herself that she could face Black Hollow Ridge again, that the people there no longer had power over her. The trading post was busy when she arrived. She kept her head high, her shoulders back, collected what she needed efficiently, ignored the whispers and stares. She was loading supplies into the wagon when Darren appeared. Well, well, her brother said. Looks like you survived the winter after all. I half expected Granger to send your frozen corpse back. Clara kept loading. What do you want, Darren? Just checking on my sister. That allowed, isn't it? You gave up the right to call me your sister when you sold me like livestock. Darren's smile turned nasty. Livestock's got more value than you did. At least you're finally earning your keep up there. Granger getting his money's worth? Clara faced him directly. Something had changed in her over the past months. She wasn't the same woman who'd been humiliated in this very building. That woman would have shrunk, apologized, run away. This woman had survived blizzards and backbreaking labor and the slow thaw of a man who'd forgotten how to be human. Better than you ever did, she said evenly. Darren's face darkened. You got a mouth on you now. Granger teach you that? Or did you learn other tricks to keep him happy? Several people were listening now. Clara could feel their attention. The old shame tried to rise up, tried to drown her. She pushed it down. I learned that I don't need your approval, Clara said. I learned that I'm stronger than you ever gave me credit for. And I learned that your opinion of me says everything about you and nothing about me. She climbed onto the wagon seat. "You'll be back," Darren called after her. "Once Granger's done with you, you'll come crawling back with nowhere else to go, and I won't take you in. You hear me?" "I won't." Clara snapped the reins. The horses pulled forward. She didn't look back, but as she drove out of town, she noticed men on horseback at the edge of the settlement, well-dressed, well-armed, watching everything with calculating eyes. Something about them made her uneasy. She mentioned it to Silas when she got back. "How many?" he asked, his voice sharp. "5, maybe 6. They wearing anything distinctive?" Clara thought. One of them had a fancy silver belt buckle. Another had a rifle with an engraved stock. Silas's jaw tightened. "Victor Hale's men." "Who?" "Cattle baron from 3 valleys over. He's been buying up land, sometimes legitimately, sometimes not. He tried to buy this place 5 years back. I told him to go to hell." "You think he's trying again?" "I think he's been waiting for the right moment." Silas looked out the window toward the mountains. "Winter's when people are desperate, when they'll sell for pennies on the dollar just to survive. He probably figures I'm weak enough now." "Are we in danger?" Silas didn't answer right away. "Maybe. Keep your eyes open. Anything strange happens, you tell me immediately." That night, Clara lay in her cabin, unable to sleep. The wind howled outside, and she kept thinking she heard footsteps. Twice, she got up to check the window. Nothing but snow and darkness, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something bad. The feeling proved right 3 days later. Clara was in the barn at midday, distributing hay to the horses, when she smelled it. Smoke. Not the clean wood smoke from a chimney, but something sharper, more urgent. She dropped the hay bale and ran outside. Orange flames licked up the side of the equipment shed. Black smoke billowed into the clear winter sky. The fire was already spreading fast, fed by dry wood and the wind that never stopped blowing through the canyon. "Silas!" Clara's scream tore from her throat. "Fire!" He came running from the north pasture, saw the flames, and immediately started barking orders. "Get buckets! The well!" They worked in desperate tandem, hauling water and throwing it on the flames. But it was like spitting on a bonfire. The equipment shed was already lost. The question was whether they could stop the fire from spreading to the barn. If the barn went, the horses died. If the horses died, they couldn't work the ranch. If they couldn't work the ranch, they'd have to abandon it before spring. Clara's arms burned from hauling bucket after bucket. Her lungs filled with smoke. Ash fell around them like black snow. Silas was everywhere at once, throwing water, beating flames with a wet blanket, shouting instructions she could barely hear over the roar of the fire. The wind shifted. Embers landed on the barn roof. "No, no, no," Silas breathed. He grabbed a ladder, scrambled up onto the roof with another wet blanket. Clara kept hauling water, passing buckets up to him. Her whole world reduced to this single desperate fight. They battled for what felt like hours. Clara's hands blistered and bled. Silas fell through a weak spot in the roof and gashed his leg open on a nail. But they kept fighting. Finally, impossibly, the flames began to die. The equipment shed was destroyed, just a smoking skeleton of charred beams. But the barn stood. Damaged, scorched, but standing. Silas climbed down from the roof, limping badly. His face was black with soot, his eyes red and streaming. He looked at the wreckage, and his expression turned to stone. "This wasn't an accident," he said. Clara wiped ash from her face. "How do you know?" He pointed to the ground near what had been the shed's entrance. In the snow, barely visible through the ash and debris, were boot prints. Fresh ones, leading to and from the shed, then heading east toward the tree line. "Someone set this fire." Silas's voice was deadly quiet. "And I know exactly who. Victor Hale. Has to be. This is how he operates. Make life hard enough that people give up and sell. Can't prove it in court, but I don't need a judge to know what happened here." Clara felt rage building in her chest. Hot and unfamiliar. Someone had tried to destroy everything they'd worked for, everything they'd built. The ranch that had become more than just shelter, more than just survival. It had become something worth protecting. "What do we do?" she asked. Silas looked at her. Something burned behind the exhaustion in his eyes. "We make sure he knows this didn't work." That night, they worked by lantern light to secure what they could salvage from the equipment shed. Tools, mostly. Some leather tack. Not much. Silas's leg needed stitches. Clara sewed it up at the kitchen table while he gritted his teeth and didn't make a sound. You should rest, she said when she finished. Can't. Got to patrol. Make sure they don't come back tonight. Then I'm coming with you. Clara, I'm coming with you, she repeated, her voice firm. You're hurt. You can barely walk. If something happens, you'll need someone watching your back. Silas studied her face, then nodded once. Get my rifle. The Winchester in the cabinet. They patrolled through the night, taking turns while one rested. Nothing happened. No more fires, no movement in the trees. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Morning came gray and cold. Clara was making breakfast when she heard horses approaching. Multiple horses. Silas grabbed the rifle. They both stepped outside. 6 men rode into the yard. The one in front sat on a black stallion that probably cost more than the entire ranch. He was maybe 50, well-fed, wearing a coat that cost more than Clara earned in a year. His face had the smooth confidence of a man who'd never been told no. Victor Hale. Silas Granger, he called out, his voice friendly and fake. Heard you had some trouble yesterday. Came to see if you needed help. Don't need your help, Hale. Silas's rifle remained pointed at the ground, but his finger was near the trigger. Now that's no way to greet a neighbor offering assistance. Victor dismounted, his men staying on their horses. A fire like that, terrible thing, could have lost everything. Lucky you had help. He looked at Clara with undisguised amusement. This your new hired hand? Bit soft for ranch work, isn't she? Clara felt the old shame trying to rise up. She stomped it down hard. State your business, Silas said flatly. My business is opportunity. Victor pulled a folded paper from his coat. I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for this land. Very fair. Enough to start fresh somewhere easier. Somewhere you wouldn't have to worry about fires and accidents and all the other misfortunes that seem to plague isolated ranches. Not selling. You should reconsider. This land is valuable to me. I'm building a railroad supply route through these mountains. Your property sits right in the middle of my planned path. Now I can work around you, but that would be costly, inconvenient. I'd much rather buy you out properly. Then you're going to be inconvenienced. Victor's smile thinned. You're not thinking clearly. You lost your equipment shed yesterday. What happens when the next accident hits? Maybe the barn this time. Maybe the house. Maybe someone gets hurt worse than just a cut leg. The threat hung in the cold air like smoke. You threatening me on my own land? Silas's voice dropped to a growl. I'm stating facts. Victor spread his hands innocently. Accidents happen, especially in winter. Especially to stubborn men who don't know when to quit. I've bought up most of the ranches in this valley. The smart ones sold early, got good prices. The stubborn ones, he shrugged. Well, they learned the hard way that I always get what I want. Clara watched Silas's knuckles turn white on the rifle stock. She stepped forward before he could do something that would get them both killed. We heard you clear, she said. Now you can leave. Victor looked at her properly for the first time. His eyes traveled over her body with deliberate slowness, his expression shifting from amusement to outright contempt. You're the Whitmore girl, aren't you? Darren's sister. He told me about you. Victor's laugh was cruel. Said you were desperate enough to work for Granger because no man would have you any other way. Looking at you, I can see why. What are you doing out here, sweetheart? Playing ranch wife? The words were designed to hurt, and they did. But Clara had learned something over the winter. She'd learned that other people's cruelty said more about them than it did about her. I said leave, she repeated. Or what? Victor stepped closer. You'll make me? You can barely... Silas moved. One moment he was standing still, the next he had the rifle pointed directly at Victor's chest. She told you to leave, Silas said, his voice like ice. You're gonna do it, now! Victor's men reached for their weapons. Silas didn't move. You pull those guns, somebody dies, Silas said calmly. Maybe me, maybe you, maybe all of us. That what you want? The moment stretched taut. Clara could hear her own heartbeat. Victor's eyes narrowed, calculating odds. Finally, he stepped back. This isn't over, Granger. I tried to do this the civilized way. You're making it harder than it needs to be. Good. I like things hard. Victor swung back onto his horse. You got 1 week to reconsider. After that, well, he smiled. Accidents happen. They rode out, leaving deep hoof prints in the snow. Clara and Silas stood frozen until the sound of hooves faded completely. He's going to come back, Clara said. I know. We can't fight 6 armed men. I know that too. Silas lowered the rifle finally. His hands were shaking slightly, from adrenaline or rage, Clara couldn't tell. But I'm not selling. This land has already cost me everything. I'm not handing it over to a bastard like Victor Hale. The week that followed felt like waiting for an axe to fall. They worked, but the fear never left. Clara kept glancing over her shoulder. Silas slept in the barn most nights, watching over the animals. On the fifth night, Clara woke to the smell of smoke. Not again. Please, not again. She threw on her coat and ran outside. The barn was ablaze. Flames poured from the open doors, climbing the walls, consuming everything. The horses were screaming inside, high, terrified sounds that ripped through Clara's chest like knives. Silas was already there, trying to get the doors open wider. The heat drove him back. He looked around wildly, saw Clara. "Help me," he shouted. "The horses!" Clara ran forward. The heat was incredible, like standing too close to the sun. Smoke filled her lungs, making her cough and gag. But she could hear the horses inside, could hear them dying. She grabbed a wet blanket Silas had dropped, wrapped it around herself, and ran into the barn. The world became fire and smoke and chaos. Clara couldn't see, couldn't breathe. She felt her way along the stalls by touch, finding the first horse and yanking the gate open. The animal bolted past her toward the light. Another stall. Another terrified horse freed. Her hands burned. Her lungs screamed for clean air. The smoke was so thick she couldn't tell up from down. Something cracked above her, a terrible splitting sound. Clara looked up just as a burning beam broke free from the ceiling. She tried to move, but her foot caught on something. The beam crashed down, pinning her legs beneath burning wood. The pain was instant and complete. Clara screamed, tried to push the beam off, but it was too heavy. The fire was everywhere now, closing in. She was going to die here, burn alive in this barn while the horses ran free, and Silas, "Clara!" His voice cut through the roar of flames. Then he was there, smoke-covered and wild-eyed. He grabbed the beam with his bare hands. She could hear his skin sizzling, and lifted. "Move!" he roared. Clara dragged herself out from under the beam. Silas dropped it, grabbed her around the waist, and hauled her toward the door. The ceiling was collapsing behind them, burning chunks of wood crashing down where they'd just been standing. They burst out into the freezing night air. Silas carried her 20 feet from the barn before collapsing to his knees. He set her down carefully, his hands shaking. "You're alive," he kept saying. "You're alive." Clara coughed up black smoke. Her legs were burned, her clothes singed, her whole body one massive bruise. But she was alive. Behind them, the barn collapsed in on itself with a sound like thunder. Sparks flew up into the night sky like angry stars. Silas's hands were destroyed, blistered, raw, some places burned down to the meat. He'd grabbed that burning beam with his bare hands to save her. "You idiot!" Clara gasped. "Your hands!" "Don't care." He was checking her legs, trying to assess the damage in the flickering firelight. "Can you move them?" "I think so." Pain screamed through her when she tried, but nothing felt broken. "Silas, your hands!" "I said I don't care." The words came out harsh, desperate. He looked at her with an expression she'd never seen before, raw fear mixed with something else, something that made her breath catch despite the pain. The sound of hoofbeats interrupted whatever might have happened next. 6 riders emerged from the tree line, backlit by the burning barn. Victor Hale sat at the front, making no attempt to hide his satisfaction. "Another accident," he called out. "This is getting to be a real problem for you, Granger. Maybe it's time to accept that this ranch is cursed." Silas stood up. His ruined hands hung at his sides. His face was black with soot, and his eyes had gone to a place beyond reason. "You did this," he said quietly. "Can't prove that. Don't need to prove it. I know." Victor shrugged. "Even if I did, what are you going to do about it? You're one man with burned hands and a fat girlfriend who can barely walk. I've got 6 armed riders. This ends one way, Granger. You sell or you lose everything. Your choice." Clara watched something snap in Silas. She'd seen him angry before, seen him grief-stricken and violent and cold. But this was different. This was a man with nothing left to lose who'd just watched everything he cared about burn for the second time in his life. And this time there was someone to blame. "Sell?" Silas's voice was eerily calm. "I'll sell you something. I'll sell you a beating you won't forget." He started walking toward Victor, not running, just walking with terrible purpose. Victor's smile faltered. "You take another step. My men will shoot you down." Silas kept walking. "I mean it, Granger. Stop right there." Silas didn't stop. He covered the distance between them in long strides. Victor's men raised their rifles, but they hesitated. Something about the way Silas moved made them uncertain. Victor drew his own pistol, aimed it at Silas's chest. "I will shoot you." Silas grabbed the gun barrel and yanked it aside. The shot went wide, echoing off the mountains. Then Silas's fist connected with Victor's jaw in a blow that knocked the man clean off his horse. The fight that followed would be talked about in Black Hollow Ridge for years. Victor's men dismounted, rushing to help their boss. Silas fought like something possessed, not clean, not controlled, just pure fury, given form. He took punches that should have dropped him and kept going. Broke one man's nose with a headbutt, kicked another in the knee hard enough to hear something crack. Victor scrambled to his feet, blood streaming from his split lip. He swung at Silas with a riding crop. Silas caught it mid-swing, ripped it from Victor's hand, and threw it aside. "You want this land?" Silas grabbed Victor by the front of his expensive coat. "You want what's mine? You'll have to kill me for it." He drove Victor backward into a water trough, dunking his head under the icy water, held him there while Victor thrashed and struggled. Clara watched from the ground, unable to move. She should stop this, should call out. But some dark part of her wanted to see Victor suffer the way he'd made them suffer. One of Victor's men, the biggest one, grabbed Silas from behind, hauling him off. Silas spun and caught the man with an elbow to the temple. The man dropped. But there were too many. They swarmed Silas, dragging him down through sheer numbers. Boots and fists rained down on him. He covered his head with his ruined hands and took the beating. Clara saw red. She didn't remember getting up, didn't remember grabbing the rifle Silas had dropped. But suddenly she was standing, the Winchester in her hands, and she was screaming, "Get off him!" The men froze, turned to look at her. Clara, fat, soft Clara, who'd never fired a gun in her life, stood there shaking, the rifle pointed at the group. One of the men laughed. "You even know how to use that, sweetheart?" Clara didn't, but she wasn't about to tell them that. "Try me," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "She won't shoot," another man said. "Look at her. She's terrified." He was right. Clara was terrified. Her hand shook so badly the rifle barrel wavered, but she was also done being afraid, done being pushed around, done watching people she cared about get hurt while she did nothing. The man started toward her. Clara squeezed the trigger. The shot went wide. She'd closed her eyes at the last second, but the crack of the rifle was enough. The men scattered. Silas used the distraction to surge to his feet, grabbing two men by their collars and slamming their heads together. Victor was backing toward his horse, his face a mask of rage and fear. "This isn't over. You hear me? This isn't—" Another rifle shot cut him off. This one came from the tree line. Everyone froze. A group of riders emerged from the darkness. Clara recognized some of them. Ranchers from the neighboring valleys, men who'd lost property to Victor's schemes over the years. At the front rode old Thomas McCarthy, owner of the biggest spread in the territory. "Evening, Victor," Thomas said pleasantly. He was maybe 70, white-haired and weathered, but his rifle was rock steady. "We heard there was some trouble out this way. Seems we heard right." "This is private business, McCarthy," Victor said, trying to recover his composure. "Between me and Granger." "Is it now? Because it looks to me like you're burning down a man's ranch with 6 armed riders. That ain't business, Victor. That's arson and attempted murder. And I got a dozen witnesses right here who'll testify to what we just saw." More riders emerged from different directions, 20 of them, 30. Every rancher Victor had tried to push around over the years, united for once. Victor looked around at the assembled men. His face went pale. "You got no proof," he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. "We got enough," Thomas replied. "We got the timing. Fire starting right after you make your threats. We got the boot prints at the equipment shed that match your men's boots. We got testimony from folks in Black Hollow Ridge about your other accidents. And now we got this." He gestured at the burning barn. "Plenty of proof for frontier justice, Victor. Question is whether we take it to the territorial marshal or handle it ourselves." The threat hung heavy. Frontier justice was rough and final. Victor knew it. "I want you gone," Thomas continued. "Out of this territory. You sell your holdings and you disappear. Because if I hear about one more mysterious fire, one more rancher being forced off his land, I'm coming for you personally. And I won't come alone. Understand?" Victor's jaw worked. He looked at Silas, who stood bloody and defiant. At Clara, still holding the rifle. At the assembled ranchers surrounding him. "You people are making a mistake," he said, but he was already mounting his horse. "I've got connections. I've got resources. You can't—" "Ride, Victor," Thomas said tiredly, "before I change my mind about letting you leave." Victor and his men rode out, disappearing into the darkness. The assembled ranchers watched them go in silence. Thomas dismounted, approached Silas. "You all right, son?" Silas looked like he'd been through a meat grinder. His face was swelling, his hands were destroyed, and he had at least one cracked rib. But he nodded. "I'm alive." "Good. Now let's see about that woman of yours." Thomas walked over to Clara. Up close, she could see kindness in his weathered face. "That was mighty brave what you did. Mighty stupid, too, but brave." "I couldn't let them hurt him," Clara said simply. "No, I don't suppose you could." Thomas smiled. "Takes a special kind of woman to stand up like that. Silas, you know you got yourself a keeper here?" Silas looked at Clara. Even through the pain and exhaustion, something showed in his eyes, something that made Clara's breath catch. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." The ranchers helped them through the night. They organized a bucket brigade to make sure the fire didn't spread. They tended to Silas's hands, wrapping them in clean bandages soaked in salve. They checked Clara's burns and declared them painful, but not serious. By dawn, the crisis had passed. The barn was lost, but the animals were safe. The house stood untouched, and Victor Hale was gone, likely for good. Thomas and the other ranchers left with promises to help rebuild come spring. Clara and Silas were finally alone, sitting on the porch steps as the sun rose over the mountains. "You saved my life," Clara said quietly. "You saved mine first." Silas's voice was hoarse. "Running into that barn like that, that was the bravest damn thing I've ever seen. Or the stupidest. Both." He turned to look at her. "Clara, I need to say something." Her heart started pounding. "Okay. When I saw you under that beam, when I thought—" He stopped, struggling with words. "I ain't felt fear like that since the day I lost Catherine and James. And I realized something. I realized I can't lose you. I won't survive it." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. "Silas, I don't know how to do this," he continued, the words coming faster now. "Don't know how to be what you deserve. I'm broken and angry, and I got more ghosts than any person should carry. But you—" He reached out with his bandaged hand, gently touching her face. "You made me want to live again, not just survive, actually live." "I'm not exactly a prize," Clara said, trying to smile through the tears. "I'm fat and scared, and I don't know the first thing about—" "Stop." His voice was firm. "You're strong and loyal and brave enough to run into a burning building for animals that ain't even yours. You're worth 10 of any other woman I've ever known. And if you think your size matters to me, you're dead wrong. You matter to me, Clara. All of you." They sat there as the sun climbed higher, two broken people who'd found something whole in each other. The ranch was damaged but standing. They were hurt but alive. And for the first time in 7 years, Silas Granger looked at the future and didn't see only loss. He saw possibility. The days following the fire moved slowly, weighted down by pain and exhaustion and the strange new awareness between them. Silas's hands were bad enough that he couldn't work properly, couldn't grip tools, couldn't handle reins, could barely feed himself. Clara's burns healed faster, though her legs remained tender and walking hurt more than she let on. They existed in an awkward dance of necessity and new vulnerability. Clara had to help Silas with things he'd done for himself his entire adult life. Buttoning his shirt, cutting his food, changing the bandages on his ruined hands. The first time she'd done it, his jaw had been so tight she thought he might crack his teeth. "I can manage," he'd said, trying to unwrap the old bandages with his wrists. "You can't," Clara replied simply. She'd taken his hands, carefully, gently, and begun unwrapping. The burns underneath were raw and weeping. She'd cleaned them with water and soap while Silas stared resolutely at the wall, his breathing shallow. "This hurt?" she'd asked. "No." Liar. The corner of his mouth had twitched, almost a smile. Now, 3 weeks later, they'd settled into a routine. Every morning and evening, Clara tended his hands. Every day, Silas fought the urge to pull away from her touch, to retreat behind his walls. And every day, he failed a little more at keeping his distance. The ranch work continued as best it could. Clara took on more of the physical labor while Silas directed, his frustration at his own limitations simmering just below the surface. Thomas McCarthy and several other ranchers had sent supplies and help, enough to get them through until Silas could work again. It was charity, which Silas hated, but Clara had accepted it without shame. "Pride doesn't keep you warm in winter," she'd told him when he'd tried to refuse. "It's all I got left sometimes." "No," Clara had said, meeting his eyes directly. It isn't. February arrived with brutal cold and snow that piled up past the windows. They were trapped inside for days at a time, the world reduced to the warm bubble of the main house. Clara cooked. Silas sat by the fire, watching her move through the kitchen with an expression she couldn't quite read. One evening, she found him staring at the locked door at the end of the upstairs hallway. He stood there like a man facing down a gallows, his bandaged hands clenched at his sides. "You all right?" Clara asked quietly from the stairs. Silas didn't turn. "I need to go in there." Clara's breath caught. In all the months she'd been here, he'd never once opened that door, never even touched the handle. "Okay," she said. "I can't." He held up his bandaged hands. "The key. It's in my room, in the desk drawer. Can you—" "I'll get it." She found the key exactly where he said, a small brass thing that felt heavier than it should. She brought it to him, pressed it into his palm. Silas stared at the door for a long moment. Then he fumbled with the lock, his damaged hands making the simple task nearly impossible. Clara gently took the key from him and unlocked it herself. The door swung open on silent hinges. The room beyond was frozen in time. A woman's shawl hung on a hook. A child's wooden toys sat arranged on a small shelf. The bed was made with a quilt that had faded from years of sunlight through the curtain. Dust covered everything like snow. Silas stood in the doorway, not entering. His breathing had gone shallow and quick. "I haven't been in here since I carried them out," he said. His voice was barely a whisper. "Couldn't. Every time I tried, I'd start seeing them, hearing them. Catherine laughing at something James said, James running around pretending to be a horse. I couldn't." Clara waited. Let him talk. "I thought keeping the door locked would make it easier. Like if I couldn't see it, it didn't exist, their deaths didn't exist. But it never worked. I still saw them everywhere else. In the barn, at the table, out by the creek where James liked to catch frogs." Silas's hands were shaking. "I've been living in a tomb, Clara. And I didn't even realize it until you showed up and started opening windows." "What do you want to do?" Clara asked gently. Silas was quiet for a long time. Then, "I want to remember them without it killing me. I want to keep the good parts and let go of the guilt. I don't know if I can, but I want to try." Clara stepped into the room. The air smelled stale and sad. She walked to the window and pulled back the curtain, letting in the weak winter light. Dust motes danced in the beam. "Tell me about them," she said. "Not how they died, how they lived." Silas remained in the doorway. Catherine was loud, laughed at everything, made terrible jokes that weren't even funny, but you'd laugh anyway because she was so pleased with herself. She couldn't cook worth a damn, burned water somehow, but she could sing. Had this voice that could make you feel things you didn't even have words for. Clara picked up a small carved horse from the toy shelf. And James? He was fearless, drove Catherine crazy, climbing everything, chasing every animal he saw. Smart too smart. Asked questions that didn't have answers just to see you squirm. Silas's voice cracked. He'd be 14 now, almost a man. I keep wondering what he'd look like, if he'd be tall like me or built smaller like Catherine's side of the family. "He'd probably be driving you insane asking to learn everything at once," Clara said with a small smile. "Yeah." Silas almost smiled back. "Yeah, he would." They stood in the room together as afternoon faded to evening. Silas told stories about Catherine's insistence on keeping chickens even though she was terrified of them, about James's habit of hiding frogs in people's boots, about the time they'd all tried to make candy and nearly burned down the kitchen. With each story, the room felt less like a tomb and more like what it was, a place where people had lived and loved and been happy. "I want to keep some of their things," Silas said finally. "Catherine's shawl, James's favorite toy horse. But the rest, I think it's time to let it go." Clara nodded. "We can pack it up, save what matters, give away what might help someone else." "Not today, though." Silas looked exhausted, like the emotional excavation had cost him everything. "Today, I just needed to open the door." They left it open when they went back downstairs. For the first time in 7 years, air circulated through that room. Light touched surfaces that had lived in darkness. It was a small thing, but it mattered. That night, they sat by the fire longer than usual. Silas's hands were healing, slowly, painfully, but healing. The worst of the burns were scabbing over. He had more mobility now, though he'd probably always have scars. "Can I ask you something?" Clara said, breaking the comfortable silence. Sure. Why did you agree to let me come here? My brother made it sound like you needed help, but you never seemed like you wanted anyone around. Silas stared into the fire. I didn't want anyone, I mean. But the ranch was falling apart, and I was too stubborn to abandon it and too broken to maintain it alone. Thomas McCarthy talked me into it. Said if I didn't get help, I'd work myself to death within a year. He paused. I figured hiring someone would be easier than caring whether they stayed or left. Just another set of hands to lighten the load. And then you showed up and you weren't what I expected. You worked harder than any man I'd hired before. Didn't complain. Didn't try to fix me or save me or any of that nonsense. You just existed beside me. Made the house feel less empty without demanding anything in return. Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. I demanded plenty, better firewood, fixed roofs, those blankets. I gave you those because I wanted to, not because you demanded them. Why did you want to? Silas finally looked at her. Because somewhere along the way, you stopped being just hired help and started being, I don't know, important. And the thought of you being cold bothered me more than it should have. When did that happen? Clara asked softly. Don't know exactly. Maybe when you stood up to me about the horse. Maybe when you sewed up my leg without flinching. Maybe when you made actual edible food instead of the slop I'd been forcing down for years. He shook his head. Probably been happening the whole time, and I was too stubborn to notice. They sat with that truth between them. Outside, wind howled through the canyon. Inside, the fire crackled and warmth wrapped around them like a blanket. I was terrified of you at first, Clara admitted. All the stories made you sound like a monster. But you weren't. You were just hurt and lonely, and trying so hard to push everyone away that you'd forgotten how to let anyone close. Still not good at it. No, Clara agreed. You're terrible at it, but you're trying. That counts for something. Silas reached out with his bandaged hand, awkward and hesitant. Clara took it carefully, mindful of his healing burns. They sat there holding hands like teenagers, both of them unsure what came next but unwilling to let go. The moment broke when Silas yawned, a jaw-cracking thing he tried and failed to hide. You should sleep, Clara said. Your hands heal better when you're resting. Yes, ma'am. There was gentle teasing in his voice now, something she'd never heard before. They stood. Clara started toward her cabin, but Silas stopped her with a word. Clara. She turned. Stay. He looked almost embarrassed. I mean, it's cold out there, and the fire's already going here. You could take the couch if you wanted. It was a terrible excuse. They both knew it, but Clara found herself nodding. All right. She settled on the couch with blankets while Silas climbed the stairs to his room. For the first time since arriving at the ranch, Clara fell asleep inside the main house, wrapped in warmth and the strange, fragile feeling that something was beginning, something that terrified her as much as it comforted her. The next morning, they fell into an easier rhythm. Silas's hands improved daily. He started taking over small tasks, feeding chickens, checking fence lines, working with the mean bay gelding that was slowly, grudgingly becoming less mean. Clara noticed changes in him beyond the physical healing. He smiled more often, not big smiles, Silas wasn't built for those, but small quirks of his mouth that softened the hard lines of his face. He talked more too, sharing observations about the weather or the animals or memories that didn't revolve around loss. One afternoon, Clara was mending clothes when Silas came in from outside, stamping snow from his boots. Got something to show you, he said. She followed him to the barn. In the far stall, the bay gelding stood calmly while Silas approached. No head tossing, no stamping. The horse actually nuzzled Silas's shoulder when he got close. You gentled him, Clara said, amazed. We came to an understanding. He stops trying to bite me. I stop assuming he's beyond saving. Silas stroked the horse's neck. Figured he deserved a real name, been calling him Ranger. It fits. Yeah. Silas turned to face her fully. I've been thinking. Clara's heart rate picked up. About? About what Thomas said. About you being my woman. He was right, wasn't he? Somewhere along the way, that's what happened. Clara couldn't find words. Silas stepped closer. I know I ain't much of a prize, he continued. I'm older than you, broken in ways that might not ever fully heal. I got ghosts and scars and a ranch that nearly killed us both. But Clara, he took her hands carefully. I want you to stay. Not as hired help, not as someone paying off your brother's debt, as my wife. If you'll have me. The world seemed to stop turning. Clara stared at him, her mind racing. You don't have to answer now, Silas said quickly, misreading her silence. I know it's a lot. I know you might not. Yes. He blinked. Yes? Yes, I'll marry you. Clara felt tears starting. You're right. You're not perfect. But neither am I. I'm fat and scared, and I don't know the first thing about being a real wife. But I love you anyway. I think I have for a while now. So yes, absolutely yes. Silas pulled her close, careful of his still healing hands. They stood in the barn while Ranger watched with mild horse interest, and snow fell outside, and two broken people held each other like they were the only solid things in a shifting world. When? Clara asked against his chest. Soon as we can arrange it. Spring, maybe. When the trails are clear and we can get a proper preacher up here. He pulled back to look at her. Unless you want something fancy. In town. With people and... No. Clara shook her head firmly. Here. Just us and whoever wants to come. Nothing fancy. Just real. Real, Silas echoed. I can do real. They spent the rest of the day planning in small bursts between work, where they'd have the ceremony, outside, overlooking the valley. Who they'd invite, Thomas and the other ranchers who'd helped them. What Clara would wear, she didn't care much. Maybe her nicer dress, if it still fit. That evening, Silas disappeared into his workshop and came back with something wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Clara. She unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a ring, simple, made of silver, with a small blue stone set in the band. It wasn't fancy. The stone had a tiny inclusion. The band showed marks from where Silas had hammered it into shape. It was perfect. Made it myself, Silas said, almost shy. Not a jeweler. If you want something better... Clara slipped it on. It fit perfectly. It's exactly what I want. The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful. They worked together with new purpose, not just surviving, but planning for a future. They talked about what they'd do come spring, rebuild the barn properly, expand the herd, maybe plant a proper vegetable garden instead of Clara's scrappy attempt from last year. They talked about other things too. Harder things. Clara's childhood, her parents' deaths, the slow erosion of her relationship with Darren, Silas's father, the abuse, the vow he'd made to never become that kind of man. You're nothing like him, Clara said one night. You're hard sometimes, yes, but you're never cruel, never small. You don't hurt things weaker than you to feel strong. I came close, with the horse, but you didn't. That's what matters. They learned each other in small increments. Silas liked his coffee strong enough to strip paint. Clara hummed while she cooked, usually the same 3 songs on repeat. Silas was left-handed. Clara was terrified of spiders. Silas read slowly and carefully old books about ranching and animal husbandry. Clara had once wanted to be a teacher before poverty, and her brother's contempt had beaten the dream out of her. You could still teach, Silas said when she mentioned it. When we're more settled, could start a small school. Lots of ranch families around here got kids with no proper education. You'd be all right with that. Why wouldn't I be? You're smart, patient, better with letters than I'll ever be. Makes sense. It was the first time anyone had treated Clara's dreams like they mattered, like they were possible. She cried about it later, alone in her cabin, and couldn't quite explain why. March arrived with the first hints of thaw. Ice began breaking up in the creek. The snow receded from south-facing slopes. Birds returned, filling the mornings with sound. Silas's hands had healed enough that he could work normally again, though the scars remained, thick, ropey tissue that pulled tight across his palms. He didn't seem bothered by them. Scars just mean you survived, he said when Clara traced them gently one evening. Nothing to be ashamed of. They set the wedding for the first week of April, when the weather would be clear and the world would be green again. Thomas McCarthy agreed to stand up with Silas. A rancher's wife named Sarah, who'd been kind to Clara during the fire aftermath, agreed to stand with her. The only question was whether to invite anyone from Black Hollow Ridge. Don't need them, Clara said. Don't want them there. What about your brother? Clara's expression went cold. Especially not him. But word spread anyway, the way it did in small frontier communities. 2 weeks before the wedding, a rider arrived with a letter for Clara. She recognized Darren's handwriting and almost threw it in the fire unopened. Silas watched her hold it. You should read it. Whatever it says, you should know. Clara opened it reluctantly. The letter was short. Clara, heard you're marrying Granger. Good for you. I won't pretend I care one way or another, but thought you should know some things have changed. I'm leaving Black Hollow Ridge, taking work in Denver. House is being sold. Your things? What few you had are in a box at the trading post. Come get them or don't. Makes no difference to me. Don't expect to see each other again. Darren, no apology. No acknowledgement of everything he'd put her through. Just cold, practical information delivered with the warmth of a business transaction. Clara crumpled the letter. He's gone. How do you feel about that? I don't know. Clara stared at the fire. I should feel something, shouldn't I? Sad or relieved or angry. But I just feel empty. Like learning a character from a bad book got written out of the story. He was your brother. He was a cruel man who happened to share my blood. Clara threw the crumpled letter into the fire. They watched it burn. I'm glad he's gone. Is that terrible? No, Silas said. It's honest. They rode to Black Hollow Ridge the next day to collect Clara's things. The box at the trading post was small, a few letters from her mother, some old photographs, a hair comb with paste jewels. Nothing valuable. Just fragments of a life she'd already left behind. Clara had braced herself for stares, for whispers, for the old humiliation. But the people in the trading post looked at her differently now. Word of the fight with Victor Hale had spread. Word of Clara standing with a rifle, defending her home. Word of Silas Granger coming back to life for the fat girl nobody wanted. The story had grown in the telling, like frontier stories did. But underneath the exaggeration was truth. Clara had changed, and people could see it. Mrs. Hutchins actually smiled at her. Tommy Baker from the stable tipped his hat respectfully. Even the store owner, who'd laughed the hardest during Edmund Halstead's letter reading, treated her with cautious courtesy. Clara took her box and left without explaining herself. She didn't owe these people anything. Not explanations, not forgiveness, not her story. On the ride back, Silas said, They treated you different. Yeah. How'd that feel? Clara thought about it. Like it came too late to matter. They only respect me now because I stood up to someone they were afraid of. Where was that respect when I was just trying to survive? People are cowards, Silas said simply. They respect strength because they don't have it themselves. Is that why you respected me? Because I was strong? No, I respected you because you were kind. Strength was just a bonus. Clara felt herself falling a little more in love with him right then. This hard, scarred man who said things like that so casually, like he didn't realize the weight of his words. The week before the wedding, Sarah came to help Clara prepare. She brought fabric, cream-colored cotton that had cost more than Clara earned in a month. I can't accept this, Clara protested. You can and you will, Sarah said firmly. She was maybe 40, weathered and practical, with kind eyes. My own daughter got married last year. This was going to be her dress, but she eloped before we could finish it. You're about the same size. Makes sense for you to have it. They spent 3 days sewing. Sarah was patient, teaching Clara finer techniques than she'd known. The dress came together slowly. Simple lines, long sleeves, a neckline that didn't plunge or reveal. Nothing fancy, nothing that would make Clara feel like she was pretending to be someone else. But when she tried it on for the final fitting, Sarah's eyes filled with tears. You look beautiful, she said. Clara looked at herself in the small mirror. The dress fit well. The color brightened her face. Her hair, which she'd learned to pin up properly, made her look older, more dignified. She didn't look beautiful. Clara knew that. But she looked like a woman worth loving. And maybe that was enough. The night before the wedding, Silas knocked on her cabin door. Bad luck to see the bride, Clara called. Don't believe in luck, Silas replied. Can I come in? Clara opened the door. Silas stood there looking nervous, which was so unlike him that she almost laughed. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. He pulled something from his pocket, a small leather-bound book. This was Catherine's, her journal. She wrote in it every day, about anything and everything. Clara took it carefully. Why are you giving this to me? Because I want you to know her. I want you to understand that loving you doesn't erase loving her. She was my past. You're my future. Both things can be true. Clara opened the journal to a random page. The handwriting was looping and energetic. The entry was about James learning to whistle and driving everyone insane with his newfound skill. I'll read it, Clara promised. All of it. And I'll tell you stories about my mother if you want to hear them. I do. They stood in the doorway, the space between them charged with anticipation and fear and hope. Tomorrow, Clara said. Tomorrow, Silas echoed. He kissed her then, soft, careful, like she was something precious. It was their first real kiss, It tasted like coffee and possibility and the future stretching out before them. When he pulled back, he was almost smiling. "Get some sleep," he said. "Big day tomorrow." "Same to you." He walked back to the house. Clara watched him go, then closed her door and sat on her bed with Catherine's journal in her lap. Tomorrow she would marry Silas Granger. Tomorrow she would stop being the unwanted Whitmore sister and become Clara Granger, rancher's wife. Tomorrow everything would change. Tonight she would read about the woman who'd come before her and learn that love didn't have limits, that hearts could hold more than one story, that broken things could be mended without erasing the cracks. Clara woke on her wedding day to birdsong and sunlight streaming through the cabin window. For a moment, she lay still, letting the reality wash over her. Today she would marry Silas Granger. She rose and washed carefully in the basin, then dressed in her undergarments and stockings. The cream-colored dress hung on a hook, waiting. She touched it gently, almost afraid it would disappear. A knock came at the door. Sarah's voice called out, "You decent?" "Come in." Sarah entered carrying a basket covered with cloth. "Brought you breakfast. Can't get married on an empty stomach." They sat together while Clara ate bread and butter and eggs that she barely tasted. Her stomach was a knot of anticipation and nerves. "You having second thoughts?" Sarah asked, watching her. "No, just regular thoughts, lots of them, all at once." Sarah smiled. "That's normal. I was terrified on my wedding day. Kept thinking I'd trip walking to my husband or forget how to speak or suddenly realize I'd made a terrible mistake." "And did you? Make a mistake?" "Not even a little bit. 42 years later, I'd do it all again." Sarah set down her cup. "Silas is a good man, Clara. Broken, yes, but good. And you're good for him. Everyone can see it." They finished breakfast and Sarah helped Clara with the final preparations. The dress slid over her head and settled into place. Sarah fastened the buttons up the back, then stepped around to look. "Perfect," she pronounced. "Now sit. Let me do something with your hair." Sarah worked quickly, pinning Clara's hair into a style that was simple but elegant. She wove in small wildflowers that Thomas's wife had brought, tiny blue forget-me-nots that matched the stone in Clara's ring. When Sarah finally let her look in the mirror, Clara barely recognized herself. Not because she looked different, exactly, but because the woman staring back looked happy. Actually happy. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice thick. "None of that now. You'll ruin your face." Sarah squeezed her shoulder. "Come on. Time to get you married." They walked to the house together. The ceremony would be held on the hillside overlooking the valley, the same spot where Silas had proposed. Already people were gathering, 20, maybe 30 folks, ranch families from the surrounding valleys, Thomas McCarthy and his wife, other ranchers who'd stood with them against Victor Hale. No one from Black Hollow Ridge, no one from Clara's old life, just people who mattered now. Silas stood near the edge of the hill, talking with Thomas. He wore new clothes, dark pants, a clean white shirt, a vest that Sarah's husband had loaned him. His hair was combed back. His beard was trimmed. When he turned and saw Clara walking toward him, his expression did something that made her heart stutter. He looked at her like she was the only person in the world who mattered. The preacher, a circuit rider who passed through twice a year, took his place. The gathered crowd quieted. Clara walked the last few yards alone, her legs shaking slightly. Silas met her halfway, offering his scarred hand. She took it. "You look beautiful," he whispered. "You look terrified," she whispered back. "I am, but I'm here anyway." "Me too." They faced the preacher together. The ceremony was simple, stripped of unnecessary pageantry. The preacher spoke about commitment and partnership and building something lasting from honest effort. He didn't mention love like a fairy tale. He talked about it like work, hard, daily, essential work. Clara appreciated that. She'd had enough of fairy tales. When it came time for vows, Silas spoke first. His voice was rough but steady. "Clara, I ain't good with words, never have been, but I'm going to try." He took a breath. "You came into my life when I'd given up on living, when I was just going through motions, waiting to die. You didn't try to fix me or save me, you just worked beside me, existed beside me. And slowly, without me even noticing, you reminded me what it felt like to want tomorrow." His hands tightened on hers. "I'm still broken in places. Probably always will be. I got scars that won't heal and ghosts that won't leave. But if you'll have me anyway, scars, ghosts, and all, I promise to stand beside you the same way you stood beside me, through fire and winter and whatever else comes." I promise to see your strength when the world only sees your size, to value your kindness when others call it weakness, and to build a life with you that's worth all the pain it took to get here." Clara's vision blurred with tears. The preacher nodded to her. She had to clear her throat twice before words came. "Silas, I came here thinking I was being punished, traded away by a brother who hated me, sent to work for a man everyone called dangerous. I thought this was the end of hope, the final proof that I wasn't worth loving." She squeezed his hands. "But you never treated me like I was worthless. You never made me feel small. You gave me work and purpose and a place to belong. And somewhere along the way, you gave me something I'd stopped believing in. You gave me a future." Her voice cracked, but she kept going. "I don't know how to be a perfect wife. I'll burn dinner sometimes. I'll say the wrong thing. I'll have days where the old shame tries to drag me down. But I promise to keep showing up, to keep working, to keep choosing you and this life we're building together, to be your partner in every sense of the word, through whatever comes next." The preacher pronounced them married. Silas kissed her in front of everyone. Not a chaste peck, but a real kiss that made several ranchers whistle and laugh. Clara felt her face flame red, but she didn't care. She was married, actually married, to a man who chose her on purpose. The celebration afterward was simple but joyful. Someone had roasted a pig. Sarah and the other ranch wives had brought food, bread, vegetables, pies made from last year's preserved fruit. Someone else produced a fiddle and began playing. Clara had never danced in her life. But when Silas offered his hand, she took it. They moved clumsily, both of them terrible at it, stepping on each other's feet and laughing. Around them, other couples joined in. The music filled the valley. Thomas raised a toast. To Silas and Clara, "May your cattle be fat, your winters be short, and your love be long." "Hear, hear!" voices chorused. They ate and drank and celebrated until the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. Slowly, families started departing, needing to get home before full dark. They left with handshakes and well wishes and promises to visit come summer. Finally, only Thomas and Sarah remained. They helped clean up the last of the celebration, then prepared to leave as well. "You two did good," Thomas said, clapping Silas on the shoulder. "Real good." "Couldn't have done it without your help," Silas replied. "Maybe not, but you did the hard part, opening back up, letting yourself live again." Thomas glanced at Clara. "Both of you did." After they left, Clara and Silas stood alone on the hillside as twilight deepened. The valley below was a patchwork of shadows and fading light. Their valley, their home. "You ready?" Silas asked. Clara nodded. They walked back to the house hand in hand. Inside, Silas had made changes she hadn't noticed before. Fresh flowers in a jar on the table. Candles lit throughout the room. The bed in his room, their room now, made with clean linens. "I tried," he said, suddenly shy. "Don't know much about making things romantic, but I figured—" Clara kissed him quiet. "It's perfect." What followed was awkward and tender and nothing like the romantic stories Clara had once read in borrowed books. They fumbled with buttons and bumped noses and had to stop twice because they were laughing too hard to continue. But it was real. Honest. Two people learning each other without pretense or performance. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness. Silas traced the burn scars on Clara's legs, faded now but still visible. "These don't bother you?" she asked quietly. "Why would they? They're proof you ran into a burning barn to save animals that weren't even yours. They're proof you're brave." "I have other scars too, ones you can't see." "I know." His hand moved to rest over her heart. "So do I. Maybe that's why we fit. We both know what it's like to be broken." Clara turned to face him. "Do you think we'll ever be completely fixed?" "No," Silas said honestly. "But I think we can be happy anyway. Being whole isn't the same as being perfect. It's just being honest about the cracks." They fell asleep like that, holding each other in the darkness, two broken people who'd found something whole in being broken together. The weeks following the wedding settled into a new rhythm. Clara moved her few belongings into the main house. Her old cabin became storage for tools and supplies. The locked room upstairs stayed open now. They'd packed away most of Catherine and James's things, keeping only what mattered most. The room itself became Silas's workshop, where he carved and repaired things in the evenings. Spring came in full force. The snow melted completely. Grass turned the valleys green. Wildflowers exploded across the meadows in riots of color. The ranch came alive with work. They rebuilt the barn together, this time with help from neighboring ranchers. It went up faster than Clara expected, sturdy and straight, smelling of fresh-cut pine. Silas insisted on better construction than before, incorporating designs he'd learned from Thomas. "If we're building it again, we're building it right," he said. Clara expanded her vegetable garden, quadrupling its size. Sarah taught her about companion planting and soil rotation. By mid-May, they had neat rows of potatoes, carrots, beans, squash, and more herbs than Clara knew what to do with. The cattle thrived. The horses multiplied. Ranger, the bay gelding, proved himself a capable stud. Even the chickens seemed more productive, laying eggs in abundance. But it wasn't just the ranch that grew. It was them. Silas taught Clara to ride properly. She was terrified at first, convinced she'd fall or the horse would bolt, but Silas was patient, walking beside her until she found her confidence. Eventually, she could ride out to check fences or move cattle without fear. Clara taught Silas to read better. He could manage basic words but struggled with anything complex. They spent evenings going through books together, Clara patiently sounding out words while Silas followed along. His progress was slow but steady. "Why does this matter so much to you?" he asked one night, frustrated with a particularly difficult passage. "Because you're smart," Clara said simply, "and you should be able to access all the knowledge you want. Reading opens doors. You sound like a teacher." "Maybe I am one. Or maybe I will be." That conversation planted a seed. Over the following months, Clara began seriously considering the idea of starting a school. The nearest town with actual education was 2 days' ride away. Most ranch children grew up barely literate. She mentioned it to Sarah during a visit. "You should do it," Sarah said immediately. "My grandchildren are already 7 and 9 with barely any learning. Their parents try, but neither can read well themselves. I don't have books, or supplies, or a proper building. Start small, use your own house, borrow books from whoever has them, charge what families can afford, eggs, labor, whatever." Sarah leaned forward. "Clara, this valley needs someone like you. Don't talk yourself out of it before you even try." Clara discussed it with Silas that evening. She expected hesitation. Instead, he said, "When do you start?" "You're not worried about having children running around?" "I'm worried about another generation growing up ignorant because nobody taught them better. If you can fix that, you should." So Clara started small. She put word out through Thomas and the other ranchers that she was willing to teach any child who could make it to the ranch once a week. She'd provide basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. The first week, 3 children showed up, Sarah's grandchildren and a shy boy named Peter, whose parents ran a struggling homestead to the south. Clara taught them on the porch, using slate boards and borrowed primers. By the end of summer, she had 8 students. By fall, 12. Parents paid what they could: eggs, vegetables, help with harvest work. Clara didn't care about the payment. She cared about the spark in a child's eyes when they sounded out their first word, the pride when they solved a math problem, the questions that showed genuine curiosity about the world beyond these mountains. Silas would sometimes sit nearby while she taught, ostensibly working on something but clearly listening. Clara caught him mouthing words along with the children more than once. One evening after the students had left, Silas said, "You're good at this." "At what?" "Making people believe they can do things they didn't think possible." He set down the harness he'd been mending. "You did it with me. Now you're doing it with these kids." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest. "I'm just teaching them to read." "You're teaching them they matter. That's different." Fall arrived with its usual brilliance. The aspens turned gold. The air grew crisp. Clara and Silas worked together to prepare for winter, cutting wood, preserving food, making sure the animals had adequate shelter. It was during the harvest that Clara realized something had changed in her body. She was tired more often. Certain smells made her nauseous. Her monthly bleeding hadn't come in 2 months. She waited another month to be sure before telling Silas. They were sitting by the fire one evening when she finally said, "I think I'm pregnant." Silas went completely still. "You think?" "I'm pretty sure. All the signs are there." He stared at her for a long moment, then his eyes filled with tears, the first time she'd ever seen him cry. "Silas? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." He pulled her close, his voice rough. "I just never thought I'd get this chance again. After losing James, I figured that part of my life was over. But now you get to be a father again," Clara finished softly. "We get to be parents," he corrected. "Together." The pregnancy was hard. Clara was sick constantly for the first few months. Her body ached in new ways. She felt massive and ungainly, though Silas insisted she was beautiful. "You're carrying our child," he'd say when she complained about her size. That's not something to be ashamed of. But old insecurities died hard. Clara caught herself thinking the same thoughts she'd heard her whole life. Too big, too much, taking up too much space. Sarah was the one who finally broke through. "You know what I see when I look at you?" she asked during a visit. "I see a woman strong enough to build a life from nothing, smart enough to teach children, brave enough to run into fire. Your body did all that. Your body is growing a whole new person, and you're worried about taking up space?" "But You're exactly what you need to be," Sarah interrupted firmly. "The world tried to convince you that small was better, that quiet and invisible was the goal. But Clara, you were never meant to be small. You were meant to take up space, to be seen, to matter." Those words stayed with Clara through the difficult months. When she felt too tired to move, she reminded herself of them. When the old shame tried to creep back, she pushed it down with the truth. She was strong, capable, valuable. Her size was irrelevant to her worth. The baby came in early April, almost exactly a year after the wedding. The labor was long and brutal. Sarah acted as midwife, with Silas pacing outside like a caged animal. When Clara's screams reached a certain pitch, Silas tried to come in. Sarah physically blocked the door. "You'll just be in the way," she said. "That's my wife. And she's doing the hard part. You can wait." The baby finally arrived at dawn. A daughter, tiny and red-faced and furious at being born. Sarah cleaned her quickly and placed her on Clara's chest. Clara looked down at the small, perfect face and felt something shift in her entire understanding of the world. This tiny person was hers. Hers and Silas's. A life they'd created together. Sarah opened the door. Silas burst in, his face wild with fear and hope. "A girl," Clara said, her voice hoarse from screaming. "We have a daughter." Silas approached slowly, like he was afraid she might break. He looked at the baby with an expression Clara couldn't quite name. Love mixed with grief, mixed with overwhelming gratitude. "She's perfect," he whispered. "What should we name her?" Clara asked. Silas was quiet for a long moment, then, "Catherine, after my first wife, if that's all right with you." Clara felt tears prick her eyes. "It's more than all right. Catherine Grace. How's that sound?" "Perfect." Little Catherine proved to be as strong-willed as her mother and as stubborn as her father. She cried when she wanted something and refused to sleep on anyone else's schedule. But she also had Silas's eyes, that distinctive gray-blue, and Clara's determination. Parenthood transformed them both in unexpected ways. Silas, who'd spent years locked in grief, now sang lullabies in his rough voice. Clara, who'd been so careful about taking up space, now took up exactly as much as she needed without apology. They moved through the days exhausted and covered in spit-up and happier than Clara had ever thought possible. The school continued. Clara taught with Catherine sleeping in a basket nearby, then later toddling around the porch, while older children practiced their letters. The students adored her, treating her like a beloved pet. By the time Catherine was 3, the school had grown to 20 students. Clara had to move lessons to the barn to accommodate everyone. Parents began asking if she'd teach more days per week. "I can't do it alone," Clara told Silas. "I need help." "Then we'll find help. There's got to be someone else in these valleys who can teach." They found her in an unexpected place. A young widow named Elizabeth arrived in the territory with her 2 children, fleeing an abusive situation back east. She'd been a school teacher before marriage. When she heard about Clara's school, she offered to help in exchange for room and board. Clara and Silas gave her the old cabin, fixed up and made comfortable. Elizabeth proved to be a natural teacher, better with grammar than Clara, but not as good with mathematics. Together, they complemented each other perfectly. The school became the heart of the valley. It wasn't just children who benefited. Parents started attending evening sessions, learning to read alongside their kids. Older teenagers came for advanced instruction. The ranch house became a gathering place for learning and community. More families began settling in the area, drawn by the presence of actual education. The valley that had been dying when Clara first arrived was now growing, thriving. And through it all, Silas and Clara worked side by side. They expanded the ranch operations, hired help when they needed it, not servants, but partners who shared in the profits, built additional cabins for workers and their families. Catherine grew into a fierce, curious child who asked impossible questions and refused to accept "because I said so" as an answer. She learned to ride before she could properly walk. She followed her father everywhere, demanding to help with ranch work. When she was 5, Clara became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier. She knew what to expect. Her body had done this before and would do it again. The second baby was a boy, strong and healthy, with Silas's dark hair and Clara's stubborn chin. They named him James, after the son Silas had lost. Silas held his new son with tears streaming down his face. I never thought I'd get to say that name again. Not like this. He's not a replacement, Clara said gently. I know, but he's a second chance. That's just as important. The years passed. Catherine and James grew. The ranch prospered. The school expanded until they had to build a proper schoolhouse. Elizabeth married one of the ranch hands, a quiet man named Robert, who'd lost his family to fever and found new purpose in helping build something lasting. More children came to Clara and Silas, a third daughter they named Sarah, after the woman who'd helped them both so much. Then twin boys who kept them exhausted and laughing in equal measure. The main house expanded to accommodate everyone. Extra rooms were added. The porch was extended. The locked room upstairs had been Catherine's original nursery, then James's, now belonged to the twins. All the ghosts had been replaced with life. Clara was 35 when word reached them that Darren had died. A letter from a lawyer in Denver explained that her brother had passed from pneumonia. He'd left no will, no family, no particular legacy. The lawyer was simply notifying next of kin. Clara read the letter twice, waiting to feel something. Grief, relief, anger, anything. But she felt only a distant sadness. Not for the man Darren had been, but for the man he could have been if he'd chosen differently. If he'd chosen kindness over cruelty, connection over isolation. She showed the letter to Silas. You want to go back? He asked. Pay respects or handle his affairs? No, he made his choices. I made mine. He's got nothing to do with my life anymore. She burned the letter and never spoke of her brother again. At 40, Clara looked in the mirror and barely recognized the woman who'd arrived at this ranch 14 years earlier. That Clara had been beaten down by shame and fear, had believed the world's assessment of her worth. This Clara had lines around her eyes from laughing, had arms strong from work, had confidence that came from building something real. She was still heavy-set, still took up space, but now she owned that space without apology. The school had become a full institution. Children came from 5 different valleys to attend. They'd hired 2 more teachers. The territorial government had even provided some funding after seeing the results. Silas was 54 now, gray-haired and weathered, but healthier than he'd been in years. He walked with a slight limp from an old injury, but moved with purpose. The rage that had consumed him for so long had been replaced by something calmer. Not happiness, exactly. Silas was too practical for constant happiness, but contentment. One evening, they sat on the porch, watching their children play in the yard. Catherine was 15 now, already talking about becoming a doctor. James was 10, horse-crazy and fearless. Sarah was 8, bookish and quiet. The twins were 6, identical and impossible to tell apart. We did all right, Silas said quietly. Clara took his scarred hand. We did better than all right. You ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't come here, if your brother hadn't sent you? Sometimes. But then I remember I'd probably be dead or married to some man who treated me like a burden. So no, I don't think about it much. This is where I was supposed to end up. You believe in fate? I believe in choices. You chose to give me a chance. I chose to stay. We both chose to try. Everything else followed from that. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the valley they'd built together. The ranch that had been dying was now the center of a thriving community. The man who'd wanted to die had 5 children who adored him. The woman everyone had rejected had become the heart of an entire valley. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Clara pulled out Catherine's old journal, the one Silas had given her before their wedding. She'd read it cover to cover over the years, learning about the woman who'd come before her. Now she opened a new journal, one Silas had bought her last year. She'd been writing in it sporadically, documenting their life for future generations. Tonight she wrote, "People will tell you that your worth is measured by how little space you take up, how quiet you are, how convenient you are for others. They will try to make you small because your bigness threatens them. Don't listen, take up space. Be loud when you need to be. Demand what you're worth. Choose people who see your strength instead of your size. Build a life that reflects your values, not society's expectations. I came to this ranch thinking I was being punished, but I was actually being freed. Freed from the opinions of people who didn't matter. Freed to discover my own strength. Freed to love and be loved without shame. If you're reading this and feeling worthless, know this. The world is wrong. You are valuable exactly as you are. Your size doesn't determine your worth. Your scars don't diminish your beauty. Your past doesn't define your future. You just have to choose to believe it. And keep choosing it every single day. It won't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But it's possible. I'm living proof. She closed the journal and looked around the house. At the toys scattered across the floor, the children's drawings pinned to the walls, the muddy boots by the door, the life they'd built from broken pieces. Silas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. Writing again? Leaving something for the kids. For anyone who needs to hear it. What are you telling them? That broken things can be mended? That second chances exist? That love isn't about perfection, it's about choosing each other, scars and all. Silas pressed a kiss to her temple. You're a wise woman, Clara Granger. I'm a woman who survived, that's all. That's everything. They stood together in the quiet house, two people who'd found each other in the darkness and built a life in the light. The ranch outside would continue growing. The school would teach more children. The family would expand and contract as children grew and left and returned. But this moment, this exact moment, was perfect in its imperfection. Because Clara Belle Whitmore Granger had finally learned the truth that the world had tried to hide from her. She had always been worthy, always been valuable, always been enough. The world simply hadn't had the courage to recognize it, but she'd found someone who did. And together, they'd built an empire for the unwanted, a place where broken people could heal, where discarded souls could find purpose, where size and scars and past mistakes didn't determine your future. Years later, when travelers crossed through Frostbite Canyon and asked about the thriving valley on the other side, locals would tell them about Silas Granger and his remarkable wife, about the school that changed everything, about the ranch that became a sanctuary, and they'd always end the story the same way. People laughed at her once, called her too big, too soft, too much, but she proved them all wrong, not by changing herself, by refusing to accept their judgment of who she was. Clara lived to be 78. Silas made it to 82. They died within months of each other, the way couples sometimes do when they've been two halves of one whole for so long that separation becomes impossible. Their children buried them on the hillside where they'd married, overlooking the valley they'd transformed. The headstones were simple. Silas Granger. He learned to live again. Clara Belle Granger. She taught him how. And beneath both names, a single line. They built a kingdom for the unwanted. The school continued for generations, eventually becoming a full academy. The ranch remained in family hands, worked by descendants who understood its history. The valley prospered. But the real legacy wasn't in buildings or land or institutions. It was in the simple revolutionary truth that Clara had lived and taught and proved. Your worth isn't determined by those who reject you. It's determined by what you build after they do. And sometimes, the most powerful act of rebellion is simply refusing to believe you're worthless. Clara had done exactly that. And in doing so, she'd changed everything.